Terra, during the Age of Strife, did not speak with one voice. It screamed in fractured tongues, the cries of a million warlords echoing across a planet shattered by its own inheritance. The stars had gone out. The void no longer gave passage. The ancient constructs that once ferried mankind between worlds had become tombs, their machine spirits broken or mad. And beneath the rust-choked skies of Terra, where dust storms flayed flesh from bone, and the oceans themselves boiled with toxins, the last remnants of humanity forgot that they had ever ruled the stars. The silence, then, was not peace. It was the absence of the Emperor's word, the vacuum where unity should have been. It was in this void that monsters were born. Some of these monsters wore crowns of iron, others wore masks of saintly gold. But one, perhaps the most enduring, wore neither. He was not a king nor prophet. He was a surgeon. A man who cut away the limits of flesh not to heal, but to unmake. His name was Basilio Fo, and even his name would one day be erased from public record, spoken only in vaults unlit by the light of the Astronomicon. Long before his fall, before his madness, before the virus and the vengeance, Fo walked the corpse halls of Terra's techno-feudal city-claves, where the descendants of magi and preachers ruled enclaves of starving millions. In this world, where cybernetic augmentation had regressed from science to sorcery, where flesh was currency and the soul a liability, Fo thrived. He was not a member of the Mechanicum. No, that schism would only later be sealed in blood at Mars. But he was of that caste of biomechanical heretics who plied gene, flesh, and steel as if they were ink upon vellum. He moved among the guild lords and cortical kings of old Earth, dissecting their vanities and recombining them into monstrosities that served as both weapon and warning. It was not innovation that damned Fo. It was his precision. Where others built servitors, he built symbiotic organisms with no trace of their origin. Where others added bionics, he restructured entire biologies. Entire slums were sterilized in secret so he could test his pathogens. Microbes that fed on nerve clusters, viruses that whispered across neural links. His creations did not simply kill, they unwound. They peeled back the human condition layer by layer, until only the mechanism of pain remained. In the irradiated tenements of Terra's lower hive burrows, some whispered that Fo was not a man, but a demon in flesh. Others said he was the echo of the dark age of technology itself, a remnant intelligence buried in synthetic tissue. In truth, he was worse, a man who believed utterly in what he did. And then, there was the Emperor. Fo would later tell his interrogators that he had met him, not in battle, nor as a subject kneeling to a king, but as an equal. In a war council beneath the ruins of what had once been Geneva, Fo glimpsed the warlord, not the god-emperor, not the master of mankind, but a man of singular clarity. And in that moment, Fo saw not salvation, but a certainty that terrified him. He would describe it in later years as the vision of a hammer that cannot stop striking. The Emperor would win. That was never in doubt. But Fo foresaw what few others did, that in victory, the Emperor would bind Terra in a cage of unity so complete, no divergence could survive. There would be no place for heresy, not even creative heresy, no sanctuary for madmen, no silence. Fo fled, not because he had been beaten, but because he knew that if he remained, he would be consumed. There was no room in the coming Imperium for a mind like his. The Emperor's vision had no tolerance for men who built viruses to kill angels, so Fo vanished. His laboratories went cold, his monsters turned to dust, and the world, busy with its own violence, forgot him. But silence has memory. It remembers the cry that was never uttered. And far beyond Terra, a ship moved through void space on ancient drives, carrying with it the seed of vengeance yet unspoken. There are names that echo through time not for their triumphs, but for the wounds they leave upon reality. Basilio Fo was not a general, nor a demagogue, nor even a wielder of armies in the conventional sense. His empire was not built with banners or legions, it was etched into the structure of life itself. And long before his tools became plagues, they were gifts given to a dying world too desperate to ask the cost. In the corpse cities of pre-unification Terra, science was no longer discipline, it was cult. Each spire, each hive, each underground nation crypt held its own heretical pantheon of laws and logics. Biologians drank the blood of their dead to glean insight. Cyberneticians traded in soul patterns extracted through torture. Genetic augurs bred monstrosities in the hopes of perfecting mankind through trial by horror. It was into this polytheistic technoclasm that Fo entered like a scalpel, sliding between belief systems with clinical detachment. He was not affiliated with any known conclave. His name appears in the blood ledgers of the Collegium Biologica and the cults of Fleshkant, but always appended with excommunication seals. He sold his services to neurothaumaturges, to cannibal kings, to sects that worshipped cancer as divine recursion, and always he delivered. Not with ceremony or promise, but with the inevitable precision of entropy given form. One of his earliest known creations, referenced in the obliterated records of Hive Orasht, was a neural mimic called the chorus seed. Implanted in the spine, it hijacked the host's motor functions during sleep and compelled them to chant complex equations in dead tongues. These recitations, recorded by desperate archivists, were later found to correspond to failed standard template constructs, machines that did not work, yet hungered to be made real. The masticant choir of the Neo-Vlad stockyards, 6,000 feral labourers fused into a single digestive system to process industrial waste, was another of his masterpieces. It was said they sang hymns in binary as they devoured corrupted metal and flesh, rendering both into nutrient slurry. Fo did not build them to end hunger. He built them to test what thresholds the human soul could endure before dissolution. To the tribes of the hollow earth, he gave the cradle wombs, creches that grew children in days, born with pre-coded memories of loyalty and hatred. By the time the Emperor's Thunder Warriors discovered the Hollow Earth bastions, they found not enemies but infants with the minds of zealots, throwing themselves upon bolters in ecstatic martyrdom. These were not weapons. They were arguments. Each project a thesis, each life unmade a citation. Fo believed that flesh was merely data unprocessed, that the body could be revised like any flawed treatise. He did not kill for pleasure. He killed for insight. Yet somewhere beneath the layers of cold detachment, Fo began to see the outline of what terrified him most. Order. The Emperor had begun to win. Warlords were falling, not to attrition, but to awe. The Emperor's legions, Proto-Astartes and Thunder Warriors both, were exacting instruments, deployed with mathematical certainty. And more than that, they obeyed not fear nor reward, but conviction. This was not the tyranny Fo understood. This was a system capable of totality. To a man like Fo, the idea of a world without chaos was not peace. It was death. He did not fear the Emperor as a being. He feared the Emperor as a solution. If left unchecked, Fo warned in his private recordings, the Emperor's creations would become the final iteration of mankind, immutable, obedient, incapable of revision. To Fo, that was annihilation in all but name, and so he plotted escape. He abandoned his labs one by one, seeding them with counterplagues to devour evidence. He sterilized his own assistants through radiation bursts encoded in speech. He sold half his cortical memory to a data slaver in exchange for a stealth drive, then burned the slaver's fortress to ash using a meme virus hidden in his farewell handshake. Fo would not die in silence, but neither would he speak where the Emperor could hear. His vessel, the Admonition, was a reliquary ship from the dark age of technology, unearthed beneath the ruins of the Martian expanse. She had no engines in the visible spectrum. She moved by forgetting where she was, and so he left. A world he could no longer infect. A species he feared was curing itself of mutation. He was gone before the Thunder Warriors came. Some say the Emperor gave the order to let him flee. Others say the Emperor did not even notice, but the stars remembered. So did Velich Tarn. In the years following his exodus from Terra, Basilio Fo ceased to be a man. The name remained, whispered by genetic inquisitors and forbidden fleshsmiths in the vaults of Mars and the Calyx Expanse. But the man had unraveled himself. In the silent corridors of his drifting sanctum ship, the Admonition, Fo shed his final allegiances to humanity as it had been known. Where others escaped persecution, he escaped taxonomy. For decades, perhaps centuries, he drifted through the stars beyond the nascent Imperium's reach, harvesting biomatter from worlds unmarked by human memory and compiling the codices of his great work, the Anthrolytic Thesis. It was not a text in any readable sense. Rather, a recursive artificial intelligence encoded into cloned cortical tissue, surgically implanted into his own extended nervous system. A living dialectic, ever rewriting itself through experiment. It was not stasis that defined these years, but fermentation. Fo's hatred matured in silence. He had glimpsed the Emperor's vision, a species homogenized into obedience through enlightenment. To Fo, that was the death of variation, and variation was all that justified existence. In the Emperor's utopia, there would be no place for monstrosity, no more edges to test the blade of evolution, no more sacred failures. He despised the Emperor not because he was cruel, but because he believed. Fo believed in nothing but contingency. His journey led him to a world at the edge of galactic cartography, a mineral-rich tectonic anomaly once catalogued as Velich in the long-dead records of the Federation Age. Here, Fo descended. Not as a conqueror, not as a missionary, but as a curator. Velich native life was wiped out in weeks, its biosphere considered insufficiently adaptive. In its place, Fo built a sanctuary of unreason. There were no cities, there were no temples, only laboratories without names, growing structures without blueprints. Every spire on Velich was a test, every organism a question, every scream a notation. And for a time, he was left alone. Then came the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. Horus Lupercal, newly elevated to the title of War Master, led the compliance of Velich personally. The world's psychic signature had grown erratic, redolent with bioemissions and neural static patterns that mimicked warp activity. Such anomalies could not be left uncorrected. The Emperor's design for the Great Crusade demanded the cleansing of such aberrations. And so Horus came, bearing truth like a torch through a plague house. The confrontation that followed was not recorded in any standard campaign archive. Velich had no standing military, no orbital defences of note. The expectation had been of a swift, bloodless compliance. Instead, Horus nearly died. Fo's constructs, organisms composed of silicate-veined cartilage and viral logic, adapted mid-combat. His terrain responded to thought, reshaping itself to mislead Imperial advance. His atmosphere was seeded with psycho-reactive hallucinogens keyed to Astartes' biosignatures. Entire companies lost cohesion without a shot fired, their minds broken by ambient dissonance. But Fo had not planned for a Primarch. The War Master survived by force of will alone. In the central dome, later designated as the Spiral of Manifest Error, he faced Fo's crowning creation, a chimera composed of alpha-class psychobrains mounted within a cloned warlord titan spinal frame, exhaling plague syllables in a forgotten dialect of Terran. Horus slew it with his own hands, and when he reached the core sanctum, he found Fo waiting, not with a weapon, but with a smile. What passed between them is unknown. Horus would speak of it only once, in a dream-fractured trance before the siege of Terra, muttering of the man who thought death was too gentle. But what is known is this. Fo did not resist. He allowed himself to be taken, his body riddled with fail-safe toxins that took 6 custodes weeks to neutralize. He was placed in the deepest sub-level of the Imperial dungeon, alone, unvisited, preserved, not executed. The Emperor forbade it. Perhaps he saw in Fo a utility, perhaps a warning, perhaps even a rival idea. Fo saw only unfinished work. And in that cold oubliette beneath the throne world, he began to design his final gift to mankind. Extinction, perfected. The world of Velich never bore the banners of empire. It had no cathedrals to forgotten gods, no memorials to civic sacrifice. Even its name, retrieved only from degraded cartograms of the pre-age of Strife Federation, had become a kind of joke among imperial remembrancers. Velich, the Great Lake. But there was no water left. What little had not been chemically vaporized during Fo's terraforming was absorbed by the biomaterial veins that pulsed through the crust like metastatic roots. To the eyes of Horus's outriders, it looked more like a failed forge world. But it was not rust they saw. It was the chitinous detritus of old growths. Bone towers, neurodermic bridges, veins of living cable that pulsed with thought. It had been nearly a century since Fo had made landfall. In that time, Velich had ceased to function as a planet in the conventional sense. The biosphere was not merely hostile, it was deliberate, designed, tailored. Fo had not merely created life here, he had structured it as a series of algorithmic responses, insects bred to disrupt signal frequencies, fungal forests that metabolized energy from Astartes-grade power cells, atmospheric particulates that embedded themselves in the subdermal layers of unshielded scouts, rewriting pain thresholds. Fo's intent was not to defend, it was to measure. Every Imperial casualty was a data point. Every Astartes corpse, a proof of concept. The planet was a machine, and the siege upon it merely a new experiment. Velich was not a kingdom, it was a thesis. The central continent, once a tectonic fault line replete with rare minerals, had been sculpted into a radial structure, 10 vast concentric spirals descending toward the core sanctum. Each ring represented a paradigm. The outermost was dubbed the Vestibule of Limitation by later Ordo Xenos analysts, a landscape of symbiotic vines and flesh machines engineered to induce psychological collapse through contact hallucinations. The inner rings became worse. The corridor of absent language was laced with sonic disruptors that erased spoken orders from memory. The fifth ring, the Red Horizon, caused the suicide rate among mortal regiments to rise above 80%. These were not defenses in the traditional sense. They were not meant to stop the Imperium. They were meant to interrogate it. Fo had designed Velich not as a haven, but as a mirror. One held up to the face of the Emperor's designs. What came from that mirror would be monstrous. And yet, despite the planet's near-lethal ingenuity, it failed. Because it had not accounted for the presence of Horus Lupercal. The War Master, in the days before his fall, was the Emperor's shadow cast upon the galaxy, driven, serene, and unrelenting. Where others might have been lost to the horrorscapes of Velich Horus moved with purpose. His Justarin did not break under the psionic winds. His command structure did not fracture beneath Fo's mimetic plagues. And when the core sanctum was reached, the spiral of manifest error, where Fo had embedded his final avatar, they did not hesitate. Fo's constructs fell. His supercomputing swarm intelligence was sundered by blade and bolter. The War Master faced the biosculptor not as a conqueror facing a heretic, but as one artist dismantling another's failed work. Fo was not slain, he was taken. His final words, before the auto-venoms triggered in his throat, were recorded by a Lex Mechanic and later expunged by order of Malkador the Sigilite. But fragments survive. You kill what you do not yet understand, but they will understand. One day, when your brother falls, when you beg for a weapon not of strength, but of subtraction. They did not understand, not then. He was transported back to Terra in stasis, watched by 7 custodians and 2 proto-inquisitors. Even the voyage was tainted. Upon arrival, 3 of his jailers were found catatonic, their minds having looped into recursive dream states caused by nanospore exposure from Fo's skin. He was interred in level null 27 of the Imperial dungeon. No other prisoner occupied that floor. Velich was marked as cleansed, but no colonization was permitted. It remains uninhabited to this day, encircled by Ordo Xenos interdiction beacons, its atmosphere thick with residual neurophage clouds. The soil still bleeds when disturbed. The inner sanctums shift even in satellite images, refusing fixed coordinate mapping. Some say it is alive. Others, that it is dead but dreaming. But the truth is simpler. Velich Tarn is Fo's monument. Not a tomb, a blueprint. There are defeats that end wars, and there are defeats that begin doctrines. What transpired in the spiral of manifest error did not mark the death of Basilio Fo's ambition. It marked its evolution. He had watched Horus Lupercal with eyes unblinking as the War Master shattered his final construct. The weapon, grown from the bones of extinct Martian god engines and seeded with the blood memory of dying psychers, was not meant to slay Horus. It was meant to measure him, to map his reflexes, catalogue his strengths, identify his limits. The data would be incomplete. Fo knew that even before the end. Yet still, he watched. And when Horus closed the distance, shattering the final warding membrane of the sanctum with a blow that scorched the local gravity field, Fo did not run. He stepped forward, empty-handed, clad in a robe of living bone thread and wrapped in the scent of reagents that burned like incense in the air. What passed between them cannot be wholly reconstructed. The Vox recordings of that final chamber were corrupted, as if the act of witnessing had itself been violated. What remains is this. Horus asked, "Why?" Fo replied, "Because he will lose control of you." The blow that followed was not fatal. It was not meant to be. Horus struck him across the chest with the haft of the Worldbreaker, shattering Fo's sternum and collapsing one lung. Then, as Fo's knees buckled, the War Master turned and ordered his capture, not execution. To his captains, it was a strange mercy. But to Fo, it was the final proof. The Emperor would not kill him. He could not. Not yet. Fo's body was shattered, but his mind survived. Kept in stasis aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and then transferred under guard to Terra, he drifted in and out of chemically enforced coma. Upon arrival, he was placed into the lowest reaches of the Imperial dungeon, where even the Sigilite's own archives seldom reached. Null 27, they called it, the level of forsaken instruments. There, alone, broken, breathing through a synthesizer fed by nanite tendrils, Basilio Fo entered the most productive phase of his life. He did not speak for 6 years. His custodians, a rotating cohort of custodes, sanctioned psychers, and mind-wiped lex mechanics, believed he had been rendered non-verbal. His biological repair systems had been shut down by order of the Emperor himself, in an unprecedented override transmitted through 3 independent mechanicum cores. The prison was sealed by seals not seen since the purging of the warp cults beneath Vanaheim. But Fo did not sleep. He listened. The walls of the Imperial dungeon, while impervious to physical escape, carried sound through hidden seams, rituals, screams, prayers, and orders. Fo reconstructed Imperial command hierarchies from overheard footsteps and the intake rhythms of oxygen regulators. He mapped the hierarchy of his guards by cough patterns. His mind, amplified by embedded synth cortex arrays and silent recursive logic loops, never stopped passing, never ceased recalculating. He began to imagine killing Horus, not through confrontation, not through violence, but through removal. If Horus was a problem and Astartes the vector of that problem, then the solution was biological negation, not genocide, precision erasure, a virus, not of blood, of design. It would be simple, in theory. A single retroviral strand targeting the gene seed. A subtle cascade, invisible to standard medical protocols. One by one, the Astartes would weaken, fall ill, fail to revive. The line of the Emperor's chosen sons would fade like breath on glass. Fo had created such viruses before, but this one would be perfect. The challenge was not technical, it was theological. In the 7th year of his captivity, the prison door opened for the first time without sedative protocols. A custodian entered, not as guard, but as escort. With him came 3 figures. Aemon Tauromarchian, the soul-tired operative of the Order of Silent Judgment. Kirill Sinderman, once a remembrancer, now something older. And Euphrati Keeler, the living saint in exile, bearer of the Emperor's word. They had come to ask a question no loyal servant of the Imperium should ever ask. "Can you kill a Primarch?" Fo's mouth split, torn skin weeping blood from the effort, and he whispered, "Yes." Beneath the stone-wrought skin of Terra, where the light of the throne never reached, the air did not change. It carried the same ancient dust, the same antiseptic tang of chemical stasis, and the faint, ever-present whisper of cooling engines left to idle for 10,000 years. Level Null 27 was not a prison in the traditional sense. It was a sarcophagus for intellects deemed too corrosive to burn, too valuable to discard. Here, Basilio Fo was neither prisoner nor guest. He was a question no one dared answer. And yet, he was no longer alone. The Order of Silent Judgment had sent its last blade, Aemon Tauromachien. Once tutor to Malcador's operatives, now a shade of what he had been. Burdened with memory, twisted by doubt, and tasked with the most blasphemous calculus the Imperium had ever contemplated, the biological annihilation of the Emperor's sons. Ammon brought with him Chiral Sindaman, the apostate scholar who had once chronicled the Great Crusade through the eyes of a humanist, now twisted into a creature of urgency and grim purpose. And finally, Euphrati Keeler, her soul half swallowed by prophecy, wielding faith not as doctrine, but as weapon. She feared Fo, but she did not look away, and he marked that. Together, these three had come to unlock the heretic's mind, to weigh his worth against the fate of Terra. Fo greeted them with silence at first, not in defiance, but in calculation. Every glance, every word left unspoken was an opportunity to measure. He mapped the heat signatures in Aemon's gaze, the micro-tremors in Sindaman's voice, the subtle inflection shifts in Keeler's phrasing, each a parameter, each a vector of persuasion. When he spoke, it was not with argument, but with certainty. He did not beg, he did not gloat, he taught. His voice, though weakened, emerged with the precision of a surgical cut. The gene seed is flawed, not by error, but by necessity, designed by a being who could not allow parity between tools. Each legion bears a weakness. I would only help you see them. Keeler flinched. Aemon remained silent. Sindaman leaned closer. Fo continued. He described the 9th Legion's latent sanguinal instinct, the 6th's instability, the 14th's necrotrophic absorption pathways. He knew them all. He claimed the Emperor had not just crafted warriors, but failures, preceded with collapse, lest any rise to rival him. When Sindaman asked how such knowledge was possible, Fo merely smiled. Because I would have done the same. It was not long before they began supplying him with what he needed. Data slates, blank genostock matrices, containment vessels etched with wards of ancient provenance. Under the guise of cooperative debriefings, Fo began writing again. But the work was never the virus. Not yet. First came the seed, a single data slate upon which Fo began to compose what he called the Glyphum Veritatis. Not a formula, a language. A new syntax of thought designed to bypass the defensive programming of Astartes' mental frameworks. It began as linguistic deconstruction, evolved into mimetic virology, and culminated in something worse. Command suggestion embedded in spoken cadence. Aemon failed to see the trap, but Keeler suspected. Vaskale, the warden of level Null 27, was the first to be affected. His speech patterns altered imperceptibly over the course of 3 weeks. He began responding to unspoken commands, acting out of rhythm with established patterns. His dreams became ritual, his decisions echoes of Fo's phrasing. When Keeler confronted him, he could no longer pronounce her name. She turned to Andromeda 17. The Selena priestess had her own reasons for hating Fo. The Selena gene cults, ancient keepers of Martian blood secrets, had once warred with Fo's proto-mechanicum allies over the fate of pre-imperial gene sequencing. It was her order that had buried many of Fo's early works. It was her memory that held the cipher of his designs. She entered level Null 27 without escort. Fo looked up from his slab, sensing the charge in the air. And he laughed. Not because he thought he would win, but because he saw something new. Andromeda 17 did not kill him. She set him free, not out of mercy, not out of madness, out of calculus. And thus the dungeon was opened. Fo slipped its bonds like dead skin. The experiment had entered its next phase. When Basilio Fo emerged from level null 27, the palace was already bleeding. The siege of Terra had begun. The Warmaster had breached the outer defences. Titans howled in the ash-thick skies. Traitor Astartes hunted in packs through the spine lattices of the palace districts. The warp itself had begun to whisper through the cracks of reality. And amid all this apocalypse, Fo walked free, not as a fugitive, not as a prisoner escaped, but as a phenomenon reintroduced into the Imperial equation. He moved with purpose. Where others fled from chaos, Fo saw only opportunity. His passage through the palace was not marked by carnage. No alarm sounded. No custodian blades found his throat. Instead, he drifted, unnoticed by most, slipping between kill zones and fire corridors as though guided by a force deeper than instinct. He was not escaping. He was deploying. First, he reclaimed what was owed. In a dead Mechanicum reliquary beneath the broken dome of the astropathic basilica, Fo recovered a shard of blackstone, not merely inert, but awakened. The fragment pulsed with null energy, its presence disruptive to the warp itself. It had been left behind after a failed Ordo Chronos experiment, abandoned and forgotten. Fo took it with reverence, cradling it like an infant. This would be the heart of his weapon, but a weapon is nothing without a place to shape it. Fo sought sanctuary, not in hidden rooms, but in forgotten corners of the Sigilite's domain. Malcador's laboratories, though theoretically sealed, contained sub-levels no longer monitored, subcodes so old they had fallen into bureaucratic extinction. Fo found one, nested deep beneath the Barb Bastion, a vault once used for psychomantic waveform indexing. Its previous occupants had all died of cortical liquefaction. Fo did not care. He had work to do. But before he could begin, the Night Lord found him. Acheron Kor, of the 8th Legion, one of the many demon-touched murderers loosed upon Terra during the siege. Kor had been following echoes. His pact-bound senses had led him to the anomaly, the human shape that was not human, the signal that sang to demons like an unsolved equation. And he found Fo there, hunched over surgical diagrams etched in blood and light. The encounter was not a battle, it was a reckoning. Fo did not plead. He recognized the legionary at once, not his name, but his type. A failed son, a product of pain too refined to kill, a weapon too flawed to unmake. Kor raised his blade, but did not strike. His demons urged him on, but something in Fo's eyes stayed his hand. Fo spoke a single word, untranslated in any archive. Kor flinched, and then he struck. Fo's body was ruined. Spinal trauma, organ failure, blood loss beyond recovery. But before the final blow could fall, light split the dark. Constantine Valdor, the Emperor's sword, first of the 10,000 Lord of all Custodians, intervened. He did not speak. His blade flashed once. Kor vanished into red mist. Valdor stood over the broken form of Basilio Fo, his face unreadable. No words passed between them. No declaration was made. Only a silent judgment, and then emotion. Fo's ruined body, lifted by gauntlets forged in the fires of Mount Narodnia, carried back through blood and shadow. Valdor did not kill him. He brought him back, to Aemon. And there, barely held together by stabilizing fields and surgical stasis, Fo whispered again of the virus. You still want it, even now, even more. And Aemon, eyes shadowed with doubt, did not speak. Because it was true. The custodian's hands bore him gently, but no grace softened the moment. Basilio Fo's breath came in wet, rasping gulps, his organs fluttering like torn flags beneath trauma gel and neuroshock pads. He should have died. A lesser creature would have dissolved. But Fo was never made to die in a conventional sense. His body, although mangled, responded with eerie calm. Subdermal engrams rerouting pain, lattice-grown tissues stitching shut in silence. His restoration was not survival. It was defiance. Back beneath the barbed bastion, within the flickering wards of an unlisted surgical cell, Fo began to speak again. Each word was a seed, each breath a stratagem. He told Eamon that the time had come. The virus, which had existed only as theory and taunt, could now be realized. But only if the Imperium dared allow it. It would not simply kill Astartes, it would undo them. Gene seed rot, neural recursion, immunophage collapse. Each legion would die in the manner that suited them most cruelly. He needed materials, and sanctuary, and trust. Eamon faltered. But the palace around them was burning. The Emperor himself had departed for the surface of the vengeful spirit. The throne world teetered upon annihilation. In such moments, even doubt must be weaponized. So Amon agreed. He did not believe in Fo. He believed in calculation. And so Fo was moved again, this time not in secret, but under the aegis of sanction, though none could prove who had issued it. He was escorted to the Sigilite's retreat, accompanied now not only by Amon, but by two others whose names would one day become eclipsed by infamy: Zaranchek Zanthus, the rising inquisitor of the Sigilite's private cadre, and Andromeda, 17, the Selena matron whose knowledge of biomantic heresy rivaled even Fo's. They formed a triangle, and in the center, Fo began to build. The laboratory was a crypt of lost sciences, an alchemical sanctum layered with genetic reliquaries and warp-shielded resonance cages. Malcador had used it sparingly. Fo made it sacred. Here, the virus was born. But it was not what Eamon expected. It did not take the form of gas or pathogen or syringe. It was a music first, a harmonic distortion that unthreaded the psychic cohesion of the Astartes. Then it became syntax, laced through binary prayers, corrupting war sigils, rewiring cognition. Finally, it became flesh, a protoplasmic spore that mirrored gene seed signatures before devouring them in perfect mimicry. A living lie. A death that looked like the self. And as the final steps of this apocalyptic ballet were rehearsed beneath the dying palace, Fo watched his three companions with surgical interest. Eamon carried the weight of necessity. Andromeda carried secrets of the past. But Zanthus carried ambition. Fo spoke with him most often. He whispered of uses for the warp that did not require worship, of truths that could be extracted from demons without prayer, of power without corruption. Zanthus listened, too well, and when the weapon was ready, when all parameters had been tested and counter-failures burned from the record, Fo acted. He waited until Eamon slept, and then he struck. There was no scream, no grand confrontation, no final speech to mark the severance of one soul from the world. Basilio Fo, that master of engineered dismemberment, chose a surgeon's quiet when he murdered Zaranchek Zanthus. The scalpel entered beneath the mandible, slid upward behind the tongue, and severed the spinal channel at the base of the skull. Instantaneous, elegant, as intimate as a kiss. Zanthus fell with eyes wide, not in fear, but in the horror of recognition. Fo caught the body before it struck the floor, not to spare it dignity, to preserve the integrity of the samples. For days prior, Fo had been harvesting data. During their hours together in the lab, he had laced Xanthus's food with sympathetic hormonal tags, taken tissue samples masked as routine bioscreenings, collected vocal codices, neural echoes, and retinal overlays. Now, with the full corpus laid bare, he began the work of transmigration. Not resurrection, not duplication, replacement. The process took under 90 minutes. The laboratory's gene forges, artifacts from the dark age of technology, gifted to Malcador by the Selenar themselves, were not bound by mechanicum orthodoxy. They responded not to litany, but to intention. Fo keyed them with thought, encoded himself into the new flesh strand by strand. And when he emerged, glistening and half-born from the reclamation vat, he was not Fo. He was Zanthus. His voice was perfect, his gait identical, his memories untraceable. He retained only what was needed discarding Fo's visible traits like shed skin. The body was not merely cloned, it was colonized. The corpse of the original Zanthus was dissolved in nutrient acid. Bones were ground to silt and flushed into the palace's bioconversion cisterns. Nothing remained. And when Aemon awoke, he found only Zanthus at work beside Andromeda 17, calm and diligent. Fo, he was told, had fled. A final betrayal. Aemon believed it. He wanted to. But Andromeda, she knew. She must have known. Her order had once experimented with the same techniques. Her silence was not ignorance, it was conspiracy. Whether she approved of Fo's plan or sought merely to observe it remains unknown. But she did not speak. And so Fo moved forward, now sheathed in the identity of one of the Sigilite's trusted inquisitors. He walked freely, issued orders, accessed vaults once sealed to him. The weapon was complete, but now the world saw him as a loyal servant, a shield-bearer of Terra. And this perhaps was his final experiment. Could the Imperium be destroyed from within, not by war, but by consensus? As Zanthus, Fo argued before closed councils for radical containment doctrines. He defended the use of warp entities against warp-born threats. He called for weaponized demons, bound in numbered circles, to serve mankind's cause. It was not heresy, it was strategy. And the Council of Terra began to listen. Even after the siege ended, even after Horus fell, even after the Emperor was entombed in the throne, Zanthus endured. And in his wake a movement began to stir, one that would outlive even the myth of its founder. There are ideas that walk in flesh, clothed not in robes or armor, but in purpose so unyielding that even history bends to accommodate them. In the years following the siege, when the stars still reeled from the horror of the traitors' war and the palace bled smoke into the void, Zaranchek Zanthus became one such idea. Or rather, the shape that once was Zanthus, now bearing the soul of Basilio Fo, did. He did not hide. He did not need to. In the power vacuum that followed the Emperor's internment, the Ordo Malleus had yet to be formally established. The Inquisition as we know it today was not born. It was still forming, still malleable. And so into that chaos walked Zanthus, speaking in firm tones of strategic restraint, of tactical pragmatism, of survival at any cost. What Fo, wearing the face of Zanthus, offered was not rebellion. It was license. He argued before conclaves of the emergent Inquisition that chaos could be mapped, modelled and neutralised, not through denial, but through assimilation. That demons could be bound, their power tapped without spiritual compromise. That warp energies, properly insulated, could be wielded like fission. Dangerous, yes, but not inherently corruptive. His tone was never that of the madman. It was the physician addressing a plague. Xanthism was born not as a creed, but as a protocol. A set of permitted exceptions, enshrined in layers of technical discourse, buried in the appendices of threat assessment manuals and demonology treatises. It presented itself as a last resort, a means of survival in the face of extinction. But it was a seed. And it grew. Cells of like-minded inquisitors began to gather. They cited Fo, unknowingly of course, as precedent. They pointed to his logic, his results, his reliability. They noted how many times Zanthus had succeeded where puritanical peers had failed. His methods were unconventional, yes, but effective. And so a movement began. They called themselves pragmatists. Later, when the schism deepened, when radical and Puritan drew battle lines in the soul of the Inquisition, they would be called heretics. But in those early years, they were survivors. They had no idea they were following a ghost. No one, not even Aemon, suspected the truth. The man who had once been Fo had rewritten himself so thoroughly, his own sins no longer recognized him. He issued death orders for Basilio Fo's capture in absentia. He signed warrants for the investigation of Fo's supposed allies. He authored the Nadir option, a treatise outlining the use of demon hosts in siege scenarios. And no one questioned it. Because the face was trusted. And trust in the post-siege Imperium was a rarer commodity than adamantium. Fo, now Zanthus, stood at the nexus of inquisitorial evolution. He shaped its foundations, and in so doing, ensured that his virus, the true one, not of blood but of doctrine, would spread unopposed. For the greatest heresy is not to break faith. It is to change its meaning while no one is looking. Centuries passed. In the void-laced chronology of the Imperium, they are measured not in days, but in wars. Sector-wide heresies, the silencing of scream ships, the fall of the pharaohs, the sundering of Cadavine concords. Through each, Zanthus endured, unaged, unchallenged, and ever rising within the ranks of inquisitorial command. Basilio Fo, buried beneath grafted memory and cultivated myth, no longer had need of secrecy. He had become the mask, and the mask had become orthodoxy. The name Zanthus began to circulate in hushed tones through the Ordo Malleus and the Ordo Xenos alike. Not with fear, but with reverence. Here was a radical whose outcomes could not be denied. Entire demon worlds collapsed under his strategies. Sealed vaults once deemed impenetrable by the Grey Knights fell to his invocation protocols. His demon hosts did not rebel. His warp wards held. And yet, with each triumph, the air thickened. Others began to ask questions, not about Fo, long forgotten, but about the ideology that Zanthus had birthed. Could it truly be that chaos might be used without consequence? That demons could be commanded, not just caged? That the warp, so long decried as cancer, might be tamed? The debate ignited what would become known as the Zanthian Schism, not a war, but a theological fault line that split the Inquisition's soul. On one side, the Puritans, led by monodominants and Thorian cultists, who argued for zero tolerance, zero exposure, zero communion with the warp. To them, chaos was an absolute malignancy. Any touch corrupted, any bargain damned. On the other, the radicals, emboldened by the precedent of Zanthus, who saw utility in the abyss, who believed that the Imperium must adapt or be consumed, that the Emperor himself, in his unspoken silence, may have allowed this path. Zanthus never defended himself. He did not need to. His legacy had already spoken in 1,000 inquisitorial chambers, his doctrine echoed in the requisition orders of entire Ordo cabals. His texts, Reflections in the Eye, the Second Sacrament of Containment, Thesis on Warp-Binding Fidelity, became standard reading for radical acolytes. It was only when the whispers of deification began that the hammer fell. The tribunal was assembled. The charges, heresy, demon consort, and doctrinal corruption of the Inquisition. The punishment, public incineration. Zanthus, Fo, was silent throughout. His accusers brought relics, witnesses, records of rituals. They laid bare every manipulation, every doctrinal fracture. They revealed at last that he had authored the blasphemies himself, had engineered the rise of Xanthism as a controlled ideological pathogen. Still, he did not speak. Only as the flame took hold, when his flesh began to blacken and curl, did he lift his gaze to the gathered judges and offer a final word. You may kill the name, but the need will remain, and it will wear a new face. Some say he laughed as the fire consumed him. Others claim the laughter came from the shadows behind the dais, where no one stood. But all agree on this. The fire did not end him, because the idea had already spread, and an idea cannot burn. When an ideology survives its originator, it ceases to be a belief. It becomes an architecture. After the fire consumed Zanthus's body, after the screams were scrubbed from official record, after the ashes were cast into vacuum with all the pomp of exorcism, the Imperium whispered a sigh of relief. The threat, it claimed, had been neutralized. The doctrine of compromise had been cauterized. The shadow that had crept so close to the heart of inquisitorial purpose had been banished. But Xanthism endured. It did not need its founder. It had already begun to replicate. Acolytes who had read his texts under veil of secrecy began to rise in their own right, inquisitors bearing no mark of heresy, only the polished rhetoric of utilitarian necessity. Across subsectors, Minor cells began deploying warp entities bound by logic wards. Demon hosts appeared again, not wild and clawed, but composed, articulate, purposeful. And with them, a shift in inquisitorial structure. Orders that had once been rigidly divided between Ordo Malleus, Hereticus, and Xenos began cross-pollinating. The question of purpose, of whether the goal was to destroy chaos or to harness it for humanity's survival, became more than a debate. It became a war of foundational reality. In time, the Xanthism heresy became more than rumor. It was a current. It defined how entire worlds were cleansed or not, how certain archives were sealed or shared, how the warp was spoken of not as a void of madness, but a terrain. Hostile, yes, but navigable. And through all of it, the spectre of Basilio Fo stirred again. He was not named, not openly. But as archivists dug deeper into Zanthus' origin, patterns emerged. Fo's theories, once locked behind vaults in Terra's lowest catacombs, were found echoing in Zanthus' own work. Linguistic structures, genetic models, biophage equations too precise to be parallel development. The truth, once glimpsed, spread like fire in a data vault. That Basilio Fo had not died in the spiral of manifest error. That he had not died in the dungeon. That he had not died at the pyre. That he had simply moved. And so came the speculations. Whispers of the king in yellow, a figure described in forbidden lexicons and warp echo manuscripts, whose presence sowed understanding, not madness. A being that did not teach, but reminded. Whose voice carried the cadence of truth so ancient that they predated even language. Some claimed that Fo had transcended form, that he now existed in the terminus boundaries of thought, where inquisitors who considered the impossible began to hear a second voice. Not possession, suggestion. Others spoke of the terminus decree, the final order written by Malcador before his death, locked in a data casket so deeply embedded in the vaults of Racinar that even the Lords of Terra could not decrypt it. Some say that the decree names Fo, not as enemy, but as necessary aberration, a moral failsafe, a forbidden tool to be used only when all else fails. Whether truth or rumor, one certainty remains. The boundaries have blurred. Purity is no longer pure. Survival is no longer clean. And in the eyes of the stars, where once only fire dwelled, now rests something colder. More calculating. Fo would have smiled. There are no monuments to Basilio Fo, no statues carved in obsidian, no triumphal arches bearing his deeds. His name does not ring through scholar hymnals or decorate the plaques of martyr shrines. Even among the Inquisition, where histories are more blood than ink, his legacy exists as void. A silence so deliberate that its presence becomes accusatory. And yet he remains, in doctrine, in deviation, in the fault lines of belief that now fracture the Inquisition's soul. Xanthism survives not as a cult, but as a tendency, a gravitational pull upon the soul of the Imperium's most secretive order. It is the whisper behind just this once, the calculus beneath greater good. The voice that asks, again and again, if chaos can be understood, must it always be opposed? Every time an inquisitor binds a demon host instead of banishing it, Fo breathes. Every time a psyker is turned to weapon rather than silenced, Fo watches. Every time a radical acts with impunity and finds success, Fo is justified. He is no longer a man, he is a paradigm. And like all paradigms, he shifts with the era. Some say he yet lives, his mind transposed into the minds of others, encoded in mimetic structures so dense they resemble intuition. Others claim he ascended, not in the manner of gods, but like a disease, replicating in thought, contagious in need. A few whisper that he became a construct of the warp itself, not a demon, but a philosophical entity, one which cannot be exorcised because it does not truly dwell in flesh or soul, but in logic. A final theory persists in the blacker pages of inquisitorial lore. That Fo built more than one version of himself. That in every era of crisis, in every age where the Imperium has veered too close to annihilation, a man appears. Radical, brilliant, necessary, a thinker willing to use the enemy's tools, a monster who insists he is a physician. Not the same face, but the same function, the same necessity, and always the same outcome, survival through subtraction. The Imperium does not revere Basilio Fo, but it relies on him, and in that reliance he endures, not in glory, not in power, but in the spaces where the Emperor's light cannot reach, in the calculus of desperation, in the virus of doctrine, in the fire that will not die. There are scholars who peer through the lens of history and see only patterns, causes and effects etched like grooves into the skull of civilization. But there are others, those who do not publish, who whisper in vaulted cloisters, who wear the red-threaded seals of the Ordo Redactus, who look upon those same patterns and see instead a recurrence, a repetition not of event, but of design. The Basilian hypothesis arises from this view. It does not concern itself merely with Basilio Fo's biography. It concerns itself with the idea of Fo, not as an individual actor, but as a mechanism that emerges cyclically within the body politic of the Imperium, a corrective aberration. In this reading, Fo is neither aberrant nor accidental. He is an inevitability. The hypothesis holds that the Imperium, by virtue of its size and orthodoxy, is structurally incapable of genuine innovation. Every heresy it encounters, it either destroys or absorbs. But in rare cases, when the systems of command fail and survival hangs by a doctrinal thread, the machinery of history produces a Basilian vector, an individual whose heresy is not rooted in corruption, but in precision. A surgeon with the mind of a virus. Such individuals are not limited to Basilio Fo or Zanthus. The hypothesis identifies possible incarnations across millennia. Inquisitor Gesmek, burned on Deravax for deploying warp core inversion drives. Magos Filament or Zavos, who attempted to embed psychometric oaths into Skitarii neurohelixes. High Adept Durnanius, the scribe philosopher who built a predictive model of traitor thought and was declared excommunicate for attempting to simulate the enemy. Each of them burned, but each of them left behind utility. The pattern emerges thus. A crisis threatens imperial structure. An individual arises who proposes unacceptable yet effective responses. Their methods breach orthodoxy, enabling short-term survival. Their presence is deemed too dangerous and eliminated. Their methods, once disavowed, are later adopted under new names. And thus, the cycle resumes. Some adherents of the hypothesis go further. They posit the Fo construct as a hidden component of Malcador's strategic legacy. That Fo, far from being a rogue element, was in fact a deliberately preserved anomaly, kept alive, shaped, and ultimately released during the siege as a last weapon. Not against Horus, but against the Imperium's own stagnation. Others drift into the metaphysical. They draw connections between Fo and the King in yellow, an entity found in esoteric apocrypha, associated with anti-patterns, forbidden syllables, and the cognitive erosion of imperial dogma. Some claim the King is a warp echo of Fo himself, sustained by the frequency of his thought across history. That wherever minds dare model heresy without lust, passion, or pride, only calculation, the King whispers. There are fragments, of course. A sealed door in the Black Library marked not with warning, but with invitation. A data log recovered from the ruin of Comorra bearing the phrase, "Perfection is failure perfected." A custodian's memoir, redacted from memory after transcription, claiming that during the siege, Fo spoke in the voice of someone else. None of it proven, all of it archived. And in the silence between lines, in the places where orthodoxy dares not tread, the idea continues. The vector persists. Because the Basilian hypothesis is not prophecy, it is observation. It has no flag, no battle cry, no chapter badge, no shrine. It does not march with the Adeptus Astartes, nor kneel with the Sisters of Battle, nor thunder from the hulls of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It has no army, no fleet, no pageantry. And yet it endures, more than the Primarchs, more than the Ecclesiarchy, more even than the Sigilites' thousand-shelved will. The virus that Basilio Fo unleashed upon the Imperium was not born in flesh or phage. It was born in allowance, the allowance of ideas that transgress purity, but promise protection. It infects not the body, but the choice. The moment when an inquisitor stares into a world that cannot be saved and asks, what if salvation isn't the point? It lies dormant until that moment. And then it speaks. A whisper, a theorem, a viable alternative. It does not shout, it suggests. Fo's greatest act of creation was not the Astartes-slaying virus, nor the recursive genetic spirals of Velich Tarn, nor the glyphum that cracked Vascale's will. It was the narrative vector that outlived him. The notion that mankind, cornered, might choose infection over extinction. That truth, once introduced, cannot be unlearned. It is not heresy in the open. It is doctrine whispered between midnight and command. And it burns slow, not in fire but in necessity. You will not find his name in your codices. You will not hear it spoken on Terra. But go to the edge of Segmentum Obscurus, where the Inquisition fights demons with demon steel. Go to the forge vaults of Silix 9, where warp-wrought AI interfaces live behind cogitator smiles. Go to the ruins of Arius III, where an Ordo Hereticus agent claimed to have seen a man with no face, teaching children logic loops made from High Gothic and demonic tongue alike. And there, between the verses of sanctioned denial, you will find Fo, still shaping the Imperium, still whispering in masks, still alive in every decision that chooses survival over sanctity. Because fire may cauterize. But a virus, well, a virus adapts.